Hello and welcome to the Let's Talk Transformation podcasts. Today's episode is looking at strategy and how to execute strategy effectively in today's digital and complex world. I am delighted to welcome Johan Gronstedt, Chief Product Officer at How and author of The Execution Revolution. Johan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
It's great to have you on the show. Johan, you've worked with hundreds of senior leadership teams on executing strategy effectively, and you've created methodologies and you're constantly helping top leadership teams to refocus on what matters, which is difficult in today's distracted world, let's put it that way. And I think we can't imagine today a CFO without financial systems or a sales manager without CRM systems. So I think the question is, why at the top of organizations and particularly CEOs are we still trying to rely on PowerPoint and Excel to execute strategies in a way that's effective and flexible? So can we start there with what for me is definition of the problem? So what does the term execution revolution mean for you? And can you share a little bit about your personal professional background that led to you focusing on execution strategies?
Yeah, it's kind of a broad jumping off point there, but let's walk through them. I think all of the questions there are relevant, but perhaps some context around me. I used to work at a niche management consultant firm like 10, 15 years ago that specialized only of the execution phase of strategy, let's say. So we would come in after the McKinseys or whatever you had done the strategy, hand over the strategy deck to the management team, and they were kind of scratching their heads on how do we get this done and get this through all of the organizational layers and through all of the behavioral resistance and so forth. So that was our niche. But the company that I work at today, our origin story is that we kind of broke out of that management consultancy firm because we became increasingly frustrated as a consultant that you go in and you do a job, but as soon as the consultants leave, they kind of fall back in terms of behavior. It doesn't stick. So we were kind of scratching our heads on can we install a better operating system into these companies, something that the managers in the companies themselves can take care of over time, because the strategy is typically a journey over 2, 3, or you have multiple strategies, so it's always happening, right? That ultimately ended up being the company that I work at today, and I'm a partner at. It's called How Technologies. We are a strategy execution software. But what was really interesting during that kind of transition phase was once you start thinking about how can we actually install a methodology that managers in real life start using, you quite quickly realize that managers in reality, they don't have that much time to kind of spend on theoretical frameworks. So you need to simplify it down to a level where they are actually like willing to engage with the ideas and so forth. So we built our own kind of proprietary methodology that takes quite a lot of inspiration from like the best stuff in Agile or the best stuff in whatever you have. And during that phase of our company, I was the chief strategy officer, which was brilliant for me because in my job description was actually reading a lot of the kind of management books and the studies that came out of all of the McKinseys and Harvard Business Reviews and whatever. And we were looking at what methodology are actually having some type of evidence around them that they will improve something, because there's so much noise in this space on how to do stuff. And mostly it's just ideas. There's very little data on kind of supporting it. And part of our origin story is also, since we have a strategy execution platform, I can actually start seeing the data on how strategy actually behaves from the top line, from the CEO view, all the way down to through the organizational layers. And whenever we introduce, changes to the methodology and something, we can do A/B testing. Did this actually improve the ability of execution, right? But then coming back to your original story, isn't it curious that we've digitalized all of the other processes within companies, but we haven't really digitalized the office of the CEO and the strategic process? That is changing, which is positive. There are many companies such as ours that see the kind of fundamental waste around strategy execution and the manual labor that goes into aggregating PowerPoint reports on multiple levels and so forth. And I do think also that the AI will play a big role in this, an important role in terms of automation of reporting and progress and so forth.
Which is interesting, but I think we're still on a niche, which has been a niche for quite a few years, but people don't step into it, which is exactly what you're saying. how do you step from strategy to execution? So how do you translate strategy to tactic to operations? And I think, luckily, the consulting model is shifting. So here's a PowerPoint of all our ideas, and then there's this huge gap to how can we deploy it in a way that's meaningful for your context, your operations, and the way your operations work today. Because I think, so many strategic initiatives fail and it's all for me to do with behavioural response to what we're proposing, but also an inability from the top to give it meaning at different levels of the organisation. And
absolutely, and making it actionable. After having worked with this for so many years, a lot of strategies in practice have a tendency to kind of get stuck in that jargon phase of strategy, digitalization, or sustainability, or diversity and inclusion. But what does this actually mean for me in my real world, right? So that's part of making strategy actionable and executable. You need to spend more time in the planning phase. I do think I've had in like other podcasts, I've had interesting discussions between the traditional or the old school way of looking at it, like 3-year waterfall planning, that type of planning, that everybody seems to agree on that doesn't work, especially with our external environment changing more quickly. But we're more agile. My honest experience is that you kind of hide behind we're agile, and what you're hiding is that you don't really have a plan at all. You don't even have the kind of quarterly or half-yearly plan. So there's a sweet spot in between the two, where I think the more common issue is that we act more day-to-day, more ad hoc, more reactive. So we don't really get the kind of strategic activities done because the whirlwind of our everyday jobs, we can kind of react our way through that. And feel that we get a lot of things done, but they are not necessarily what's important or will move the needle or make an impact on your market.
And I think Agile is caught up in what we're discussing. So they've made it very binary for me. So it's either waterfall or Agile. Whatever Agile means, Johan, because I think it's the same discussion around consulting models and operational models within Agile. What does being Agile mean? And so they're ticking a box saying we've gone to Agile, and like you say, they don't have a strategy really, because they don't have the agility around the thinking of what that strategy may look like. I mean, what are the most common execution challenges you've observed? Because for me, we're trying to shoehorn complexity, which is now digitalized, which is brilliant in a way, into a binary model. And for me, that's the biggest shift in terms of mindset at the C-suite level of what does that mean? I can't just tick a box, put it on a poster on the wall, like I do with my values often, and then not decline it into what I'm expecting to see behaviorally, what I'm expecting to see operationally, and what it means for us as an organization and the way we do things. Let's put it that way.
I like to think of the process as containing two major kind of phases. You have the phase of strategy formation that carries its own problems, and then you have the phase of execution. And obviously those will be iterative along a year because things are happening and so forth, but they have different problems, right? So if we start with the first one in terms of strategy formation, one of the biggest problems that we see is that you have a tendency to be overambitious in terms of not realizing that there's a zero-sum game of time within my company. So the more goals, the more initiatives that I try to run in parallel, the less attention each of these goals will actually get. So that problem is usually fixed at the management team level. And in the management team level, their view on this poor strategy execution typically is about, well, we have too low engagement at the lower levels, or the problem is really at the middle management level. Whereas my perception is that no, it actually starts at the top. And it starts with a failure to prioritize, and a failure, depending a little bit where you are in the world, but in the European context, for example, there's I would say an overwillingness that the strategic process should be too bottom up.
Yes.
So the typical process for a strategy is that maybe you decide on some like strategic pillars on the management team level. That's where you'll find the digitalization or whatever. And then you roll this out through PowerPoints within the organization, and middle level manager, lower level managers, they start to fill in what can we do to digitalization. So even though if you squint a little bit, everything kind of attaches to digitalization, but there's really no coherence around it, and nobody has this kind of cross-functional view and more revolutionary view, investment-heavy view perhaps, on what are the big things that perhaps make us industry leaders all of a sudden. So these ideas are all aggregated up from the bottom, and there's no impulse really to say no at any time, because then they feel that that would mean that we say no to the engagement
Yes.
that is being generated within the company around these ideas, and it's uncomfortable to say no. But you kind of have to, because again, you come back to it's a zero-sum game with time, right? So I think a great like strategy formation process is both top down and bottom up, because there will be a lot of good ideas that you can generate from the bottom, but you still have to take responsibility in the management team in terms of narrowing the bets that we take, giving them the right resources, the right time allocation and so forth in the strategic plan. And that means that at a certain point in time, we need to say no to these ideas in order to really be able to execute on these game-changing ideas, right? So that's the bigger problem of like the strategy formation part of it.
And I think that's really obvious in your book. I mean, I love the fact that there's a story woven into your book, okay, where we meet all the characters of a top leadership team, but we don't only meet the top leadership team, of course, we meet all the layers of their direct reports and their teams and what's going on. And the fact that, you know, that story unfolds from strategy formation, as you say, to execution, to digital acceleration, which is an enabler, but also can be problematic if we don't use it properly in terms of distraction and just diluting what we've formed at the top as a strategy. So, you know, we learned, what I took from that is less is more, and that CEOs and the C-suite must equip themselves with the best tools available, but also that they need to communicate and constantly translate for the levels below them. Can you tell us what that means for you in today's digital age? So you have these two pillars of formation and execution. What does digital acceleration bring to that, Johan?
So it's a really interesting question with a field now that is quite rapidly moving as well. When I talked about this for 2-3 years ago, perhaps, the big value of digitalization of this process is that most people who are more immature when it comes to strategy, they have a tendency to view strategy mostly as something that we roll out. It's a communication challenge at the end of the day. Whereas my perception of it is that you win or lose it in terms of your ability to execute it. And that's going to be way more like it happens every week in every team, and the ability to aggregate deviations up to the level of where they can be solved really quickly and spot them quickly. That's a huge challenge in a non-digital environment, because it costs a lot of time to start aggregating information. So you can't run that process at the frequency they actually need to run it. I have a big customer here in Sweden, one of our biggest employers, that they can only run the kind of strategy follow-up process once per year, because it's so intense on the middle level managers in aggregating information and so forth. And if you also introduce that strategy is a lot about change.
Yes.
If you set a target in your New Year's resolution to get in shape in January, and you follow it up for the first time in December, you're not going to be in better shape.
No,
and the same is true for companies, of course. So you need to follow it up more. And their digitalization makes a lot of sense, because you can move from, say, the PowerPoint universe, and everybody kind of subjectively aggregate upwards whilst wanting to look good. So there's a lot of beautifying of progress as you move upwards, to a more streamlined and realistic view on progress. And from the CEO perspective, this is so frustrating, because a lot of the things that are hidden whilst we beautify, we could have actually done something about. This is important for us. This is perhaps the most important stuff. So the fact that it's hidden, from my view, is incredibly frustrating from the CEO perspective. Now, if you move into what's happening today, AI is making a big impact, and it's massively on my roadmap the last couple of months as well. It offers a couple of things to me. One of the biggest challenges in practice, once you're in this kind of execution phase, and we set the narrowed focus from the top, let's say, one of the biggest kind of hands-on challenges for managers running teams is to kind of find key activities that are strategic enough, because they're
Yeah.
so, like, their head is so into my operational responsibility.
Yeah.
So what you need to do is kind of take a step back and say, okay, what is truly important? And that behavior is very uncommon amongst leaders. They act
Yes.
more ad hoc, week to week.
Yes. They're reactive, aren't they? They're reacting to what's going on around them as opposed to being anticipating and being more proactive.
Exactly. So what we're doing, for example, in our software is that we know so much about, okay, you're a finance team or you work in this industry and yet you're a part of this initiative. And we can use all of that metadata to suggest to you, these would be really good activities for you to do. So taking a lot of the responsibility of qualitative planning from the shoulders of the managers and suggesting here is established best practice if you want to do this type of digitalization, for example, and here are the tools. So that's one part that's really changing, and this is also putting tremendous pressure on the kind of consultancy model, because that what you would use to buy is that expertise, right? And now it's just readily available to everyone for a GPT subscription. The second thing is, in the strategic process, you have a lot of unstructured data. So you have PowerPoint templates, you have business intelligence data that might be structured but might not be used in the way that you could use it. You have all of the meetings that are going on in companies. All of this data you could kind of capture and structure, analyze with AI, and present back in terms of reports or insights for where should you focus now if you only have an hour as the CEO, what's most important for you to do in order to support your company. So these developments are really exciting for, I think, the whole digitalization field, because it used to be a little bit that you needed to be almost a pioneer in thinking, moving this process into a more 21st century world as a CEO. Soon it's going to be so just smooth. You have to do so much less of the heavy lifting and the change management and making lower level manager take this step back and reflect and so forth. A lot of that we can kind of simplify using technology. So it's really exciting field right now.
It is, but it's creating space, isn't it, for me, for senior leaders to do what their remit, which is not necessarily just to make decisions, it's to create the conditions for quality decision making to happen. And we see that happen in the story in your book of how they have to create that space mentally to step back from what's going on and to create the conditions. And that also means saying no to things, which is also difficult for them, but they then have to help their teams do it. So I think creating the conditions for quality decision making to happen, but also keeping their hand and eyes on operations. I think there's far too much of, when you get to the top, you've just got other people to do your operations. And your book was music to my ears when I read that, because you can see how the CEO and the C-suite are struggling at first to understand what's going on in operations and not necessarily feeling it's part of their responsibility. But when we get to the end of that whole process and the book, we can see that those two pillars of creating conditions and essentially to empower my team to, make quality decisions and also understanding what's going on in my operations are really key to navigating the complexities of strategy execution. And you talk about it's like walking a tightrope. Is that what you mean? Is that the balance you're talking about around the tightrope?
Yeah, the tightrope analogy I think works in different aspects, but that's for sure one. How do you balance things that have a payoff horizon on your kind of bonus horizon, if that makes sense, and your incentive structure, and things that are more strategic that typically goes beyond your bonus. And bonus is interesting because we're all incentivized, or not necessarily all, but a lot of senior leaders at least do have incentive structures that wouldn't optimize for strategic stuff. They optimize for the more short-term stuff, which is really interesting. But it's also, you asked in the beginning of this interview, what's the reason why I called it the executional revolution? And this ties into this question as well. In time with that, our external environment is changing quicker and quicker. We're going through more and more of these kind of external disruptive events. Just the last few years, I mean, it's been one thing after the other. And then taking a look into the future, and I mean, I'm 38 years old. I have a bunch of years left to go. Like when I retire in the 2060s, 2070s, perhaps, what will actually work look like at that time scale with the pace of change right now? So my thesis is that companies that become really great at executing and being quick in these kind of changes, because that's something that we just have to become good at, will be a competitive advantage. So you'll see companies that aren't necessarily the most innovative thinkers from an engineering perspective or something like that, but our core skill is execution and aligned execution. That will be a huge thing. And especially if you think about it as in the context of a leader, your audience perhaps, becoming very good in terms of, I think most people feel that change is happening to them.
Yeah.
It becomes a reactive stance, which is also extremely exhausting from a brain perspective.
Massively.
But if you're the change agent, it's something completely different. So kind of training that skill in terms of how do I actually drive positive change and being in the driver's seat of change, both from a competitive standpoint, but equally from my own motivation and my ability to be creative over time, is a huge or a great investment in kind of your own career.
If I look at behavioural change statistics, and of course I work a lot on this with leadership behaviour and things like that, 87% of leaders across the globe are reactive, which means that we have a huge challenge, but also a huge opportunity. And if I come back to your process, which is relatively simple,
has to be.
Yeah, exactly. But it's relatively simple, but I can see it getting quite complex as people try and run it if they don't have support. Can you walk us through the top-down part of MIG, strategic initiatives, key activities, and then the strategy stand-ups? I love the idea of the strategy stand-ups because retrospectives, stand-ups, daily meetings, people always link them to operations but less to strategy. So I think it's really interesting if you could just walk our listeners through that process.
Absolutely. So there's 4 elements to the process. The first element, we call it most important goals. It's the ability to prioritize out of my usually 20, 30 priorities goals, what are the most important ones? And dedicating kind of the full force of the organization around those. From a top-down perspective, it starts in the management team. It's very difficult really for anybody else to start this. It becomes like you started in a vacuum, you don't have all of the information. So you start typically in the management team. They prioritize down to what is truly most impactful for this company. And then if you look at the organizational chart, any team that aligns directly to that team, so those will be the functional heads or whatever, they say, what can we do in order to support that goal that we can control within sales, within IT, whatever, but is aligned towards this direction above. And then it follows that logic all the way through. So the front end and back end teams under IT development, they align their goals to the IT goal that is aligned to the management team goal. So it's a pretty simple process. Usually you can quite quickly have a conversation in your team around, okay, these are all our goals. And if I want to give a very concrete tip to your audience, it's almost impossible to say what goals aren't important. So don't go down that route in order to get to your most important goals. But it's quite easy to have a conversation. If we achieve this goal, what's kind of the financial impact of it? And you can see quite big differences between the different goals that we currently run. And then you more or less put a star mark next to the ones that are most financially impactful. Those will be your most important goal. And try to limit them to perhaps 2 to 3 at the same time if you want to really optimize for performance.
Which is a far cry from 20, isn't it?
It's a far cry from 20. But out of those 20 goals that people have, like our experience is that at least 10 of them aren't goals. There's something else. They're like activities or initiatives or something else. So there's also a lot of confusion on what are we looking at here. And a goal to me follows a SMART goal framework, right? It's something measurable from something to something at a specific date, right? The next level of the methodology is, okay, the goals are fundamentally at the end of the day, they're the outcome that we're interested in. It's the revenue numbers, the profit numbers, whatever. But they're driven by concrete, especially if you look at it from the organizational perspectives. What are the big bets that we want to make in order to enable these goals? So in different companies, these are called multiple different things. It's the must-win battles, the strategic initiatives, strategic pillars, how-to wins, but they're all fundamentally the same thing. And it dates back actually to the 60s, Peter Drucker, Management by Objectives. The problem with those is that you tend to stay, and we've already talked a little bit about this, but you tend to stay at the level of the buzzword. So it becomes just digitalization or just
sustainability or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So what you need to do with them, especially in the context of the management team, is break them down into what are the kind of strategic projects that we're running. And for organizations that are used to kind of program management style, they're quite good at this, but that's not the average organization. So the average organization needs to increase clarity, ownership, who owns these initiatives. And that's a big difference between who owns it and we have a project sponsor in the management team, somebody who more broadly talks about it as a good thing. So the owner is responsible for the planning. So in 3 years, we need to be here and we need to generate this amount of revenue, for example. What does that mean for this year? And breaking it down to what must then be true in 9 months, 6 months, 3 months. So the bigger milestone planning. And somebody needs to own that. And that's an individual person on all the different levels.
Accountable for the delivery.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. The third component we call key activities. And here we come into, okay, how do we actually support from a team perspective these most important goals and these initiatives? Well, it's what we do, and think of it in the context of you're trying to lose weight. It's not the amount of times that you stand up on the scale to weigh your weight. It's how many times do I hit the gym, or what's my diet looking at? So it's the input to the process. So this methodology is an activity-based steering model. But my experience is where most people go wrong with activity-based steering is that they tend to want to capture too much of your working week. So it becomes micromanagement instead. And I don't think that's necessarily a good thing at all. No. I think quite the opposite. I think that's quite bad practice. But what you want to do is, as a team, say these are our most important goals, and we're part of these 2 out of the 5 initiatives that are run across the company. What do we need to do concretely in order to support these? And this wouldn't necessarily be your operational tasks. And this kind of ties into the digitalization question that we talked about before, because you wouldn't capture these activities in your CRM system or in your Jira or whatever system that you have, because you capture these in PowerPoints and Excel today. So these are not going to be your operational activities. These are the bigger things that are moving the needle, aligned towards your goals and so forth. That's what I call the strategy formation process. Then the question becomes, how do we endure change over time? And you discussed the strategy stand-up before, and this is completely stolen from the Agile framework, but modified slightly. So in terms of these activities, they are a little bit longer in scope or bigger in scale. So you don't need to meet on a daily basis. And for those who aren't aware of what a stand-up is, it's a pretty simple process. It's you debrief, what did you say that you wanted to do yesterday? Did you actually do it? So you hold people accountable. And you make a promise, a commitment for what will I do today? So it's a super simple process. But you do this more on a weekly or a bi-weekly basis, and then you only discuss these key activities that relates to our strategy. And this is run in our customers' example, for example. It's run from all the way from the bottom line teams all the way up to the management team. And typically you would piggyback this meeting onto whatever weekly meeting you already have. So it's a quick meeting. It usually takes like 15 minutes. And you do that at the beginning of your normal weekly meeting, very focused. What are we doing on strategy? Because what you're competing with is your calendar time.
Of course.
So you want to create a deadline out of these strategic things that you could otherwise just push for next week, because you have some more important operational stuff that feels more pressing, more burning, more urgent at least. But it's not more important, it's just more urgent. So you tend to push the important stuff. This process is also quite nice in terms of escalating issues or blockers in a company. So you might start on a Monday morning at 9 a.m. on a frontline team. They do their quarter. Their team manager is part of the management team above that, right? So they can escalate to that level, and you can continue and escalate. And what's really nice for the CEO perspective is that already around lunchtime, I can have an organization of 10,000 people committed to something very concrete and specific that relates to our ability to execute our strategy. We do this every week. So it's no wonder that we actually increase our ability to execute our strategy, because we have that conversation concretely in every team every week.
And you're building a muscle though, aren't you? You're building agility muscles within the organization. So, and what I like about the 4-step process is it is a sustainable systemic change. You're changing the habits of the elements of a process, and therefore that system carries on as they get used to it. And we see it in the story in your book that they actually get to it becoming not second nature but a reflex, and then it really starts to work because you have the discipline behind it in terms of both individual and collective discipline around. We've only got 15 minutes. This is what we need to focus on. We've proved to ourselves that this is what we need to focus on, etc., etc. Which brings me to other methodologies and tools and your assessment, Johan.
Yeah.
Could you walk us through your assessment? And I know that you use it for research as well, and this is how you iterate on the process we're talking about.
Correct. So the assessment is a tool that we actually started using this as part of our sales process because we realized that different organizations, in the strategic process, you're so dependent on specific parts of the capabilities of a customer organization. So if the leadership is very strong, that makes the implementation of a strategic process much simpler. So we needed to control for, in order to provide the right guidance to different clients, we needed to control for their baseline. Then over time, this tool grew quite a lot to what it is today. But fundamentally, it's 6 different perspectives that we start by asking the CEO in a structured interview. I think it's roughly 80-something questions by now. So we start out looking at how is the strategy formulated? Have you prioritized down to the critical few and all the things that relates to strategy? We look at the ability to change and the ability of lower level managers to carry change through the organizational levels. We look at a bunch of things around how do you currently measure? What's your steering system? Do you have any type of activity-based steering in place already? We look at how is the conditions around the management team and the CEO specifically, how much time did they actually dedicate to the strategic tasks? What's the quality of their management team meeting? But it becomes a baseline where we, with the amount of research that we've done and the amount of research that is available from external sources as well, we can give a pretty accurate estimate of what is your likelihood of succeeding with your strategy on a percentage scale between 0 and 100%. Which is fundamentally very interesting from a CEO perspective. And then, of course, there are going to be exceptions to that rule. So some organizations are just in a very nice market, so they might make their revenue, but it's not due to what they're doing as much as it is external factors, and the opposite as well. We're doing excellent, but our market is completely collapsing around us, so we can't really do that much about it. But controlling for those things, the assessment would be what are you doing from a CEO perspective and from a management team perspective, and what's the likelihood with that setup that you will succeed with the business goals that you have. When we started doing that assessment, actually as part of our sales process, is something that we offer free of charge because it helps us so much as well in terms of narrowing down what are your specific focus areas and what are the recommendations in order for you to increase your chances and so forth. But once the customer actually, yes, we want to do this, we do the same assessment with the whole management team. Okay. And the variation is really interesting there as well, because from the CEO perspective, and I'll give you an example. One of the questions is, my strategy is clearly formulated and well understood by my management team. And you have a self-estimation between I completely agree to I don't agree at all. The average answer from the CEO perspective is, I think it's around 89 or 90% if you average it out across the hundreds of these assessments that we've done. So the strategy is always perfectly formulated. And then when you ask the same, perfectly clear. And then when you ask the same question from the management team, it's not at all the same. No. So there's a grave overestimation from these kind of senior roles on my own clarity. And by the way, the managers that said, no, the CEO isn't as clear, when you ask them, but are you clear? Yeah, they are. And if you have their subordinates, it's not clear again. So it's kind of Chinese whispers, and that's what goes on in companies. And there's a great study that was published by MIT a couple of years ago that looked at this. What's the average alignment across? And I think they had more than 4,000 companies in that study. It was a really good data set. And turns out that already in the management team, the alignment is only 50%,
Yeah, I read
51%.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, which is like,
It's only half.
start somewhere. Yeah, it's only half. And the other half is doing something slightly different. So if you have an execution problem, maybe start there, right? But since each organizational level has this kind of logic of somebody interpreting and so forth, at the employee level, it was only 13% that knew about these are the most important things for the company.
Wow.
And then remember again that that's I know what to do, and then you have all of the behavior change still left in actually doing it. It's so it's no wonder that 1 out of 10 strategies deliver on time and the financial value that it's intended to. So the problem is massive. It's huge.
It is. Do you think it's compounded by organizational design, and by that I mean silos and the mentality that goes with that? Because we're talking about transversal initiatives across organizations, across departments, across how do you see that hindering effective execution, and has digitalization improved that?
It's a brilliant question.
Thank you.
And I completely agree with it. No, but it's so spot on, because I would say more than 95% of the strategies that comes across my desk are highly dependent on cross-functional work.
Yeah.
And out of those companies that have those type of strategies, I rarely, if ever, see excellent cross-functional execution capabilities.
Yeah, although it's a pillar of Agile.
Spot on in the problem.
It's a pillar of Agile, though, isn't it? And that's my point about making Agile binary and shoehorning it into the way we think and work today.
Yeah, and it's also compounded by other things. So if you're looking at a couple of years ago, all of the major consultancy firms, they tried to solve this issue by creating matrix organizations.
Yes.
And I don't know if you worked with clients that are running matrix organizations. To me, and this is highly subjective, but it seems that everything is just worse in matrix organizations. So there's something about having multiple managers that are kind of conflicting in both. What are they demanding of me? What are their mandates? There's so much more politics involved in the kind of matrix organizations to me. So our idea was, how can we execute cross-functionally while still being in a completely traditional silo model organization where sales is sales and IT is IT. Okay. So what we do is, from a data perspective, everything is linked to different things. So activity is linked to a most important goal, or an initiative is linked to another most important goal. So everything kind of ties together. So what you do if you're an initiative owner, is that you set up milestones, and then you can have multiple teams to contribute to the same milestones. But from their team view, I have my activities that might align to a milestone that's highly cross-functional. And it's only a few higher level managers perhaps that needs to have this kind of cross-functional planning sessions. So we don't need to change the whole operating structure while still executing the things that we need to do in order to reach the cross-functional targets. So I think digitalization is an enabler for this, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think I heard you say before, and I agree, technology is one part, but it's also wisdom to use technology in the right way. And the way that I look at our company is that it's not just a software company, it's a methodology supported by a software. And the combination is what makes it work. So you can implement any tool in the wrong way and you get zero outcome of it.
And I think that brings us to another buzzword, sort of collaboration, and what you're talking about in matrix organizations, which I think served a purpose in terms of creating a little bit of agility when they were created. But it's collaboration overload, isn't it? So we don't need to collaborate all the time, and that's what you're talking about. And I think digital cuts through that quite well in terms of, you've got a platform, we don't need a meeting, this is what we're looking at, you can all different time zones can work on it at a different time, etc., etc. But it doesn't solve the issue of communication and human connection around giving meaning to what we're doing and how to motivate each other, either within a sales or an IT organization. But that transversal bit has to become reality somehow, doesn't it? And I think digital enables things so much and automates things so much that we have time now to speak to each other and to actually have meaningful conversations, but we don't necessarily do that. And in your book, you talk about different persona. I loved this bit. I won't go through them all, but I would invite our listeners to read it. Autonomy illusionists, consensus chasers, short-term optimists, and others. But can you tell us which of these personas you see most frequently and what resistance that organisations are typically facing? Because I think it's all about people. Organisations don't transform, people do. And digital's great, but the more interconnected we get, and this is my school of thought, I'm happy to be challenged on it, the more interconnected we get, the more we need to understand and navigate the human systems of our organisation.
I agree, and I don't feel a need to kind of challenge you on the idea. I do think there's so many human elements around change. And that goes both for the ability to kind of engage and create a vision for why is this company a more interesting company post this whatever digitalization project that we have going on. But it's also in all of the kind of uncomfortable situations around the people that are struggling with change. And the part of the book that you're referencing is you have different personality types when it comes to behavior resistance. And behavior resistance is not a kind of one-trick pony, and you can't have a one solution for handling resistance in general. So you need to tailor that to whatever resistance that you actually see facing. So I go through, to my experience, what are the kind of common resistance types and the rhetoric that I feel has been most impactful to deal with the different specific types. And I think that you will have different behavior resistance on different hierarchical levels.
Yes, absolutely.
So I think if we think about your audience as leaders primarily on different senior levels, I do think that you'll find a lot of kind of short-term optimizers, people that are struggling with the kind of delayed gratification of strategy, optimizing more for my everyday, struggles with taking a step back. Those people are really helped by process for doing that. So following a process on kind of a yearly cycle okay, now it's time to do this activity X, usually gives them a lot of benefit, and including them in kind of what's the down the road consequence of just thinking short term and having that conversation. I think for newer managers, they're more comfortable with kind of chasing consensus or thinking that everybody just performs best when they're given complete autonomy. And I don't see that as often in senior level managers. They are there as well, but those are more traits of the more junior manager. I think on the kind of bottom level, you'll have the people that are in general have a tendency to try to avoid anything that goes outside of what my current status is built on. Because it's a threat also, right? Yeah. I have 40 years of experience in an analog world, and now we're saying that we're going digital. What's going to happen with me, right? Yeah. And that might be both a personality trait. If you go into like the Big Five model, it's openness. Like how open am I to new ideas and curious? And that's something that can be stable over time. But it's also just the brain's fear of, hey, this is something new. This is a threat to your survival, right? And then I think just like people on lower levels as well being very distracted by what's happening in their operational whirlwind. I would say that is probably, if you're going to choose one thing to focus on, the ability to separate, this is what you're doing in your operational work versus this is what we need to do in order to make this company viable in 3 years' time. That's probably the biggest challenge. And then that obviously comes in different situations and shows its face in different ways.
Yeah, but to get them to understand that collectively, everyone has to individually transition, and that they have agency in that, even if they've been working analog for 40 years and we're now going digital, for example. Okay. But time is running, but I would like to ask you a last question about future trends, Johan, and what you would see as the next big trends in strategy over the next 5 years. So I'm going to put us out to 2030. What do you think will be happening in the strategy execution space? I'm putting them both in the space because we need both, of course.
It's an interesting question because it's happening so much right now that it's one of those points where it's almost a little bit difficult to judge the future. I used to get this question a year ago, and I had the perfect answer back then. Now it's interesting because I don't really anymore. I have ideas. Let's say.
Is that because of
One
technology,
thing,
though, Johan? Is that because
yeah,
technology is moving so
it's
fast?
AI specifically.
Yes. Yeah.
AI
Okay.
specifically. Yeah. So if we start off by excluding AI, I would say the bigger trends when it comes to strategy is everything is becoming increasingly cross-functional. So the ability to execute cross-functional things will be a question of, again, competitive advantage.
Yeah.
We're moving towards shorter strategy horizons. So if you look back 10, 20 years, it was quite usual that we had a strategy that would endure over 10, 20 years. We had a foundational principle, and it was more like business planning. It wasn't strategic overhauls. So these horizons are becoming increasingly short. And what's interesting for strategy in that perspective is that it's not necessarily true that the goals are changing or the most important goals in our model, but we need to find new paths as our external environment changes to get to that goal. And the speed of which you can find new paths is going to be a competitive advantage. I'll give you an example of that we saw like back in the early days of COVID, for example. If you were a sales organization and you were used to doing physical sales, the speed at which you can transition over to digital sales made a lot of difference that year in terms of our ability to generate new clients. So that's going to be true in any external event. So how quickly can you move from kind of a management team decision to execution on the front line? That's the execution revolution in a nutshell. That speed and that alignment. Thirdly, I think we see a lot of, in general, digitalization of all roles and CEO specifically. They have been, I think, actually before COVID, I think COVID drove a lot of digitalization across CEOs.
Yeah, massively quickly.
But they have, yeah, absolutely. But they are fundamentally still quite analog.
Yes.
In terms of they are reliant on secondary and third-hand information because everybody else has their own system, but the CEO doesn't really, as we talked about in the beginning of this conversation. But you also have the digitalization of both kind of strategy rollout and the communication, but also the follow-up. So decreasing the amount of times that we force middle managers to spend on kind of building PowerPoint slides and sitting in progress meetings and so forth. So that's a lot of, because that time in itself creates zero value.
No,
it might create a little bit of value that you have to think about it, but the value of just putting information on a slide isn't creating value at all. So if you can automate that process a lot, you can also free up a lot of time. But you also free up a lot of time as you increase the quality and the clarity of the tasks and the activities. So what you'll find a lot of an average manager's time actually going to is ineffectively communicating what do we need to do. So they need to communicate the same thing over and over again because they were just unclear in terms of that handover. And digitalization and the right methodologies around digitalization helps that a lot because you clarify definition of dones and stuff like that.
Yeah, of course.
So those would be the three things outside of AI. And then you bring it into the AI. I think there are two main kind of highways where AI will impact. One is what we discussed before in terms of increasing the quality of plans and generating the advice that you used to have to lean on management consultants or the internal experts on a specific subject area. To give you can now get much simpler and all of the tools in my space, my competitors and so forth, we're all building, I would assume, similar functionality to kind of aid that process. But the second thing is capturing all of the unstructured information and how we can I had a super interesting conversation. I don't think we'll get here, but I had a very interesting conversation with a startup in Palo Alto just last week. So a lot of companies, especially in the US, not as prevalent here in Europe yet, but they're using AI transcribers on meetings, right? They were looking at a functionality for measuring sentiment of the strategy in the company by listening in to all of the conversations and see how much are people actually discussing this digitalization initiative in practice in their meetings versus discussing other things. So they can have like kind of interesting statistics by just capturing unstructured information. I think, especially in Europe, we're going to have privacy and compliance
I was
concerns
just going
around
to
that
say
type
that.
of
Yeah.
workflow. So I think it'll be much slower in Europe. But having said that, it's also interesting from like the European competitive perspective, because if they're doing it in the States, I would
Yeah.
assume that they get some benefit of it.
Yeah.
And I think the way that we approach AI in Europe is kind of frustrating to me also from building a product depending on AI. It's so unclear what is the legal framework around
Around
AI,
AI.
what type of talent do we have access to in Europe and so forth. So we'll
And
see.
and how are we growing it? The European
Exactly.
pipeline
Yeah,
for that. I mean, do you think the
absolutely.
analog nature of CEOs, Johan, is linked to is generational?
I do. And that's also part of what's changing because it's generational to the point. I don't think that the CEOs in their 50s are necessarily part of the problem, but the ones that are bridging 60s and 70s, those are. But they are slowly migrating away towards other roles.
Yeah.
And the people coming behind them, they are way more digital. So this is quite rapidly changing now. And what's interesting as well is that there I've seen at least a couple of studies looking at the digital proficiency in the C-suite
Yes.
correlated to financial performance.
Interesting.
And
Yeah.
it's really, really clear that if you don't have a digital proficient C-suite, the financial performance of the company is way lower. So this put also pressure from more the owner
Yes.
perspective on this question. So if you have a CEO that is the
Yeah.
digital dinosaur, this is on the agenda of the VC firms or whatever you might have as the owner collective to actually, well, that's not good enough in the competitive field that we're in now.
God, that's a whole other subject, isn't it? We won't get into that because we don't have time. But if you had a final call to action, if there's one thing that you would like our listeners to take away from our conversation, where we've covered a lot about strategy and strategy execution, what would it be?
I'd love for them to invest in their own skills, to be change makers. I think my book is an excellent starting field for that.
Absolutely.
Ideally, and I hope you agree, it's a quite easy book to kind of get your grasps on. I tried my best, at least, in order not to make it a kind of a boring theory book. It's kind of how-to-y and like in practice, how would you run this without any need for outside support. So that's one call to action. Then secondly, I do a podcast, a bunch of stuff through my LinkedIn. So if you think the area in general is interesting, the LinkedIn is kind of my main platform for that.
Okay.
So give it a follow. It's always appreciated.
And is that where people can get in touch with you to find out more about the assessment and in general what you do and your thought leadership on the subject? Is LinkedIn the best place?
I try to draw everything towards my LinkedIn, and I'm really active there. So if you reach out to me, I'll always answer and stuff like that.
Okay, super. Thank you so much for coming and sharing what's in your book, which is a great book, by the way, and it's not boring at all. It's very it's very simple, and you have a story woven through it. So there's lots of actionable examples in there. And thank you for sharing your insights and what you're seeing and the trends in the market today. And thank you for a great conversation, Johan.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.